Good day to all, and thank you very much to the organizers for this opportunity, to Ambassador Dijani, as well as the DIRCO and UN Information Center colleagues. And if I may take that infamous shortcut, all protocol observed. Let me begin by way of anecdote. And that is that I had the good fortune to be part of the South African Observer Mission to the elections in Palestine in January 2006. I was assigned to that geographical triangle of Nablus, Jenin, and Tulkarm. And in so doing, I came face to face, really, with the ugly face of Israeli occupation. And because of this experience, I therefore attach very great significance to the show of solidarity with the Palestinian people, because their struggle is very reminiscent, I would argue, of the struggle across Africa for independence, self-determination, and self-reliance. But above all, the similarities between the South African and Palestinian quests for freedom, human rights, and justice were not lost on me at all. And in fact, they resonated quite profoundly. And here let me recall the words of that famous philosopher of the French Enlightenment, Voltaire. And Voltaire said, the sentiment of justice is so natural and so universally acquired by all mankind that it seems to be independent of all law, all party, and all religion. And I would imagine that that pretty much encompasses very much the life history and contribution of our Tambo. Now, in reflecting on what I could possibly say here today, I thought that it might be important to reflect and bring us back to historical memory, because this is very important in understanding the logic and dynamics of dispossession, oppression, and injustice in Palestine. Very important to note some of these historical markers. The first is that Palestinians trace their historic roots in Palestine from the time of ancient Canaan as part of the glorious Arab Islamic Empire. This was an empire, I should remind you, that could boast of brilliant intellectual achievements in medicine, philosophy, astronomy, mathematics, physics, the arts, architecture, and so on. And throughout history, the centrality of land and village, has been the basis of Palestinian social organization, and both Christians and Muslims have very deep religious ties to Palestine. Remember that Palestine was the birthplace of Christianity and the site of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, his nighttime ride to paradise. By the first half of the 19th century, there were then major economic, social, and political changes which affected Palestinians, as well as other Arab Ottoman subjects. Palestine was then very much an impoverished province of a declining empire, poorly administered, lacking in basic infrastructure and services, and heavily taxed. These dynamics then gave rise to the consolidation of a Palestinian consciousness and the twin but mutually reinforcing identities of being a Palestinian and an Arab. In turn, these identities then formed the basis of enduring Palestinian opposition to and rejection of the Zionist enterprise. By the 1870s, Jewish colonies began to appear in Palestine, financed by the French banker baron Edmond de Rothschild, such that by the turn of the century, Zionist colonization became much more systematic, it became much more methodical, and was internationalized. But the conquest of Palestine, let me remind you, ladies and gentlemen, was not simply a Zionist endeavor, because the great powers, primarily Britain, had a hand in playing a very duplicitous diplomatic game to ensure its regional interests, very much in the vein of what happened in the carving up of this continent of Africa at the Berlin Conference. Now continuing with my historical narrative, if I may.
Yes, you may.
In 1916, Britain and France then secretly signed the Sykes-Picot Accord, in which they agreed to divide most of the Arab world into spheres of influence. So France was to have authority in Syria, from which it carved out Lebanon, while Britain was to have control of Iraq, Transjordan, and Palestine. And then comes the great historical moment in 1917. And that is Britain issuing the infamous Balfour Declaration, thereby pledging its unbridled support for Zionist objectives in Palestine. Then we move on to 1920 and the San Remo Conference, where Britain and France were then given mandates for these territories and subsequently approved by the League of Nations. And this then confirmed the imperialist designs defined in Sykes-Picot. Britain then assumes the Palestinian mandate, the mandate for Palestine, from 1920 until May 1948. And while Palestinians resisted Zionist encroachment through labor strikes, civil disobedience, rebellion, and armed insurrection, the British response was as brutal as it was oppressive. And the Zionists took note and learned very valuable lessons from Britain's harsh emergency regulations and practices. And included here are things such as the closing of newspapers, search and seizure operations, mass arrests and incarceration, without trial, I might add, deportation of resistance leaders and imposing curfew, all of which then come together as a form of collective punishment. A very important historical fact to note as well is that prior to November 1947 and the approval of UN Resolution 181, which partitioned Palestine into a Jewish and a Palestinian state, there were 50 years, 5 decades, a half a century of plans, policies, preparations, and actions to empty and depopulate Palestine of Palestinians. Therefore, the conceptual vocabulary of transfer, dispossession, expulsion is embedded in the very anatomy of Zionism. And it is so evocative, I would say, of apartheid designs and practices. So from the 14th of May 1948, when Israel declared its independence, the fundamental function of the Jewish state has been to serve as a place for the ingathering of the world Jewry as codified in their law of return, such that by December 1948, that is in 7 months, Israel had illegally appropriated a quarter more territory than it was allotted in terms of the UN partition plan. So the stage was really set in terms of this very brief historical account for a very vicious and cynical zero-sum game in establishing a sovereign Jewish nation state on 78% of historic Palestine, and so accelerating the process of rendering the Palestinian people destitute, dispossessed, dispersed, and stateless up to today. And the most fundamental fact, which is central to any understanding and analysis of Israel and the Palestinians' history from 1967 up to today, up to the present, is that the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem remain under the iron fist of Israeli occupation, with very catastrophic effects on Palestinian society, its economy, its cultural expression, and the political rights of Palestinians. And it would seem that these hardships really reflect a very primary and tense dynamic in the Israeli-Palestinian interface. On the one hand, there is hardened Palestinian resistance to Israeli occupation, and a stiffening of peoples and their legitimate representatives' resolve based on a resurgent Palestinian nationalism and dedication to the cause of freedom and justice. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, there are relentless Israeli efforts to maintain, deepen, and extend occupation in order to socially, politically, and economically engineer and manipulate the territories under its control towards a Jewish demographic majority. And as we all know, this has been achieved through very extensive and ruthless violence and repression by the Israeli state. Its settlement drive is underpinned unambiguously by a policy of de-development of the Palestinian economy such that it binds Palestinian people and what's left of Palestinian territory in a structural relationship of dependency on Israel. So there's a lot more that can be said, obviously, about the historical record, and talk about the impacts of the two intifadas in 1987 and 1991. We can talk about the impact of the Cold War, the Gulf War. We can talk about, the ambivalence and ambiguities that surround the Oslo Accords in 1993. We can also talk about the changing geopolitics of the Middle East, and on and on. But the observation that I'd like to make in concluding is that the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885, which defined the rules and consequences of annexation and fragmentation of Africa and the African continent, there's a very similar narrative that plays itself out in Palestine's major themes. These concern the distortion of its politics, the distortion of its economies, and the general distortion of Palestinian society. It has ruined indigenous cultures, and it has quite seriously retarded social development. So in the case of Palestine, to conclude, this is a story of injustice. It's a story of statelessness, dispossession, occupation, resistance, and steadfastness in the face of a brutal, oppressive, and racist Israeli regime, as Ambassador Hijazi set out so eloquently. We must therefore, and I'll leave you with this message, remain very firm and at one in solidarity with the Palestinian people as a primary moral imperative, in our collective quest for truth, justice, and human rights. And I would say to do anything less would diminish the significance and relevance of why we are here today. And I thank you. Something that was raised about South Africa doing deals with Israel, which I find extremely bothersome and perplexing, particularly at a time when we see a very aggressive and a sort of assertive diplomacy by Israel across Africa to win friends and influence people. And as we know, as we speak, the Israeli Prime Minister is visiting Kenya as part of that project. And if I may say so in this building, and I know Dirko can't detain me, there is a drift away from a principled foreign policy in this country to one that is much more transactional and instrumentalist. And doing deals with Israel, in my view, is symptomatic and a manifestation of this. Now, if I may just mention very quickly, I've raised this issue with Mr. Aziz Pahad, who is the chairperson of the South African Council on International Relations. I said, listen, you really have to put this in the public domain. We need to have a debate. This must be part of the public discourse about how we understand and, in terms of citizens, influence and shape South Africa's foreign policy. It's extremely important. And I think I'm inspired, in terms of the letter and spirit of today, to raise this issue again with Aziz Pahad. So stay tuned. I will report back.
Thank you very much, Professor.